In Manhattan, the unspoken corporate rule is simple. Never grab the microphone from the person holding the master source code unless you want your $120 million investment to burn with a single click. At 10:14 last Tuesday morning, I was fired on a live stream before the board and 40 investors. My new boss thought he won, unaware he just triggered a legal time bomb he personally signed. Hello and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. We are so incredibly grateful for your continued support. Recently, YouTube disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without the budget to keep producing the content you love. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon to access even more incredible, exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can join by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment below. Now, let us dive into today's story, told from the perspective of our protagonist, Emery Cook. The air in the boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Manhattan Tower was heavy, cooled to a sharp 68 degrees, yet it still felt suffocating. The low, incessant hum of the industrial air conditioning unit vibrated subtly through the soles of my shoes. The only illumination came from the harsh, sterile blue light of the massive projector screen, casting long, sharp shadows across the mahogany table. The room smelled of fresh espresso and Julian Vance's overpowering, aggressively spicy designer cologne. It was the scent of a man trying far too hard to mask his own incompetence. I stood at the head of the table. On the massive grid of the video conference display, the blank, unreadable faces of partners from 5 of the largest American investment funds stared back at me. This was the moment. The live demonstration of the Apex Vanguard core financial technology system, a beast of an architecture I had built from the ground up over 3 grueling years. My voice was steady, cutting through the silence of the room. I guided them through the latency tests, demonstrating transaction speeds that were fractions of a millisecond. The demonstration was flawless. The code was a symphony, executing complex algorithmic trades with brutal efficiency. I could see the subtle nods from the investors on the screen. We had them. The $120 million funding round was practically secured. Then the screen flickered. My presenter remote went dead. A small notification popped up in the top right corner of the display, indicating a master override. I turned my head slowly. Julian Vance, my newly appointed boss, stood up from his leather chair at the far end of the table. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, a smirk playing on his lips. Julian was a man who spoke entirely in hollow buzzwords, possessing exactly zero understanding of the underlying matrix that kept this company alive. He had forcefully taken control of the screen mirroring from his laptop. Instead of fighting him, instead of creating a scene in front of the people holding the checkbook, I took a half step back. I let my expression go completely blank. I yielded the stage. Julian puffed out his chest and began to speak. He regurgitated the technical features I had just demonstrated, wrapping them in meaningless phrases about paradigm shifts, synergistic growth metrics, and disruptive vertical integration. It was embarrassing, yet he delivered it with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had just invented the wheel. I stood there, silent and observant, watching him claim total victory for a system he did not even know how to boot up. Despite his linguistic gymnastics, the platform itself was robust enough to carry his hollow presentation across the finish line. The investors were impressed by the software, not the man speaking over it. The demonstration concluded as a resounding, undeniable success. Julian leaned into the microphone at the center of the table. The red indicator light was glowing brightly, broadcasting his audio to the most powerful financial players in the country. He looked directly at me, the smirk widening into a cold, triumphant grin. "Thank you, Emery," Julian announced, his voice booming through the room and across the digital feed. "But our new strategy no longer requires your outdated mindset. You are fired." The silence that followed was absolute. It was not a gradual quieting. It was a violent, instantaneous vacuum of sound. On the video grid, eyebrows shot up. Several investors froze, staring at their cameras in blatant shock. A senior partner actually leaned forward, his mouth slightly open. Julian had done the unthinkable. He had executed a public, humiliating termination of his chief architect live on a multi-million-dollar pitch call. Julian waited for a reaction. He wanted tears. He wanted outrage. He wanted me to scream or beg so he could solidify his position as the dominant force in the room. I gave him nothing. My pulse remained entirely steady. I looked at the small black presenter remote still resting in the palm of my hand. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered my arm. I placed the plastic device onto the polished mahogany table with the gentle, final reverence of placing a single flower upon a grave. I did not utter a single word in my defense. I did not look at Julian again. I turned on my heel, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor, and walked toward the heavy glass doors. The entire board of directors, present both in the room and on the screens, watched me leave in complete and utter stunned silence. The hallway outside was bright and empty. I pressed the button for the elevator, my breathing remarkably calm. The stainless steel doors opened. I stepped inside and hit the button for the lobby. The descent was rapid. Exactly 45 seconds after the elevator doors closed behind me, my pockets began to vibrate. First my personal smartwatch, then the company mobile device. I pulled the phone out and watched the screen. The execution was entirely automated and brutally efficient. In a synchronized cascade, my corporate email refreshed and prompted a login error. The secure server tunnel disconnected permanently. Within the span of those 45 seconds, Julian had effectively erased my digital existence from the very company I had built. But as the elevator chimed at the ground floor, a small, genuine smile finally crept onto my face. He had no idea what he had just done. I did not take a cab back to my high-rise apartment on the Upper East Side. Instead, I descended into the subway, letting the roar of the southbound train wash over me, and rode it deep into Brooklyn. I walked 3 blocks through the fading afternoon light until I found an old aluminum-sided diner. It was a true relic from the 1970s, a place smelling faintly of burnt coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and old vinyl booths. The jarring contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled glass box I had just been exiled from was exactly the atmosphere I required. The air here was heavy with grease, not corporate tension. I slid into a dimly lit corner booth, ordered a plain black coffee from a waitress who did not care who I was, and pulled my personal laptop from my leather tote bag. The battered Formica table, sticky with ancient maple syrup and faded by decades of use, became my new tactical command center. Connecting to my encrypted personal hotspot, I bypassed the corporate networks I was now entirely locked out of. I did not need their servers. The files that actually mattered were safely stored on a private, decentralized drive I had established exactly 2 years ago. I opened a master PDF document labeled Foundation Point 01. Julian and his newly appointed cronies on the executive team looked at me and saw nothing but a high-level employee to be disposed of. A chief architect they could simply unplug when she became inconvenient. They had completely failed to understand the fundamental architecture of the company itself. I was not just another staff member on a payroll. I was the original co-founder. My eyes scrolled deliberately down the dense, suffocating legal text, settling on page 47, Clause 8.4c. It was the core protection clause. I had buried it beneath thick layers of standard corporate jargon and intentionally dry administrative formatting. It sat securely in a chain of legacy compliance emails that Julian, in his arrogant rush to take power, had clearly marked as unread. The clause itself was beautifully simple and absolutely lethal. It explicitly dictated that Apex Vanguard was only legally authorized to receive the pending $120 million disbursement from Beacon Hill Capital under one strict, non-negotiable condition. Emery Cook had to be actively operating, physically present, and legally bound as both the chief technology officer and the sole legal administrator of the core system. According to the founding corporate bylaws that I had personally drafted and codified, terminating my position required a highly specific and grueling sequence of events. It demanded a minimum of 30 days written notice delivered by a registered courier. Far more importantly, it required the unanimous, 100% written consent of the entire board of directors, signed and notarized prior to the execution of any termination order. Julian firing me on a whim, acting on pure ego over a live audio feed, without a single piece of preliminary paperwork, was not just a dramatic power play for the investors. Legally speaking, it constituted a severe, immediate material breach of the funding contract. My phone buzzed heavily against the diner table. The screen illuminated with a highly encrypted, self-destructing text message from my personal attorney, Vivian Vance. The fact that she shared a last name with the man who had just publicly fired me was a piece of cosmic irony I always found mildly amusing, though I knew for a fact they shared absolutely zero blood relation. Vivian was a ruthless shark in a tailored wool suit, a woman who read corporate bylaws for sport and destroyed executives for a living. I swiped open the notification. The message contained a single, chillingly precise sentence. They just manually triggered a capital freeze order. I picked up the thick ceramic mug and took a slow, measured sip of the terrible diner coffee. The bitter, scorched taste grounded my racing thoughts. Vivian was absolutely right. By publicly and illegally ejecting me from the organization in direct violation of Clause 8.4c, Julian had inadvertently severed the legal bridge connecting Apex Vanguard to their institutional lifelines. He had essentially locked the company vault from the outside and thrown the only master key into the river, all while smiling proudly for the cameras. A lesser person would have retaliated immediately. A typical ousted executive would have spent the rest of the afternoon frantically drafting an emotionally charged, 1,000-word letter to the Human Resources Department, begging for an exit interview or threatening a massive wrongful termination lawsuit. They would have taken to professional networking sites, publishing long, self-righteous posts about toxic workplace culture, corporate betrayal, and the cruelty of the technology industry. I did none of those predictable things. I slowly closed my laptop. I did not send a single angry email. I did not text my former colleagues to explain my side of the story. I did not issue a public statement or call a press contact. In the vicious, high-stakes ecosystem of financial technology, noise is exactly what your enemies expect. They prepare for the screaming. They hire expensive crisis management teams to handle the predictable fallout of a public dispute. But silence? Absolute, suffocating silence is a terrifying void. It is a black hole that absorbs all their strategic planning and leaves them grasping at shadows. I knew that by disappearing completely from the grid, by offering zero resistance, zero defense, and zero communication, I was forcing Julian and the entire board of directors to sit alone in the quiet. And in that quiet, without a target to fight back against, it would only be a matter of time before they realized they were sitting directly on top of an active, ticking landmine. I left a $10 bill on the sticky table for the $2 coffee, packed my bag, and walked out into the cool Brooklyn evening. The game had not ended in that high-rise boardroom. It was only just beginning. The dominoes did not just fall, they shattered. I watched the cascade from a quiet bench in Central Park, a gentle morning breeze rustling the leaves above me, while the digital world I built burned to the ground. My secure, read-only dashboard, a perfectly legal diagnostic tool I maintained under my personal developer license, painted a vivid picture of the sheer administrative terror unfolding downtown. At precisely 8:30 in the morning, the managing partners at Beacon Hill Capital executed their first maneuver. They transmitted a formal, electronically certified notice of indefinite suspension to the entire executive board of Apex Vanguard. The document stated unequivocally that due to a critical and unauthorized alteration in core personnel, the disbursement of the next funding tranche was legally halted. The money was frozen. Within 45 minutes, the contagion spread to the internal valuation metrics. The company's private stock, previously projected for a massive surge, faced an immediate lockdown protocol. Key infrastructure contractors, the massive data centers and security auditors who kept our servers breathing, began flooding the legal department with urgent inquiries. They demanded immediate, notarized clarification regarding the legal status of the primary system representative. Without my authorized signature, the service-level agreements were technically operating in a void, creating a catastrophic liability for every single vendor connected to our grid. Down in the financial district, I could almost smell the flop sweat soaking through Julian Vance's expensive suit. Desperation breeds stupidity, and Julian was a remarkably desperate man. In a frantic attempt to control the narrative and stop the bleeding, he drafted and dispatched a company-wide internal memorandum. I watched the email hit the server logs at 10:15. "Team," the memo read, "we want to wish Emery Cook the best in her future endeavors. She has voluntarily decided to leave the company for personal reasons to pursue other opportunities. Our strategic transition remains firmly on track." It was a pathetic, transparent lie, built on the assumption that institutional investors are as gullible as mid-level managers. The managing director of Beacon Hill Capital did not even wait an hour to respond. The fund representative fired back a direct reply, bypassing Julian entirely and copying the entire board of directors. The response was not a negotiation. It was a legal ultimatum. They demanded immediate, undeniable proof of this so-called voluntary departure, specifically requesting the official separation agreement bearing my authenticated, physical signature. They gave the board exactly 4 hours to produce a document that simply did not exist. That was the moment Julian finally realized the depth of the grave he had dug for himself. My personal cell phone, resting quietly on the wooden park bench, began to vibrate. It vibrated again and again and again. I watched the screen light up with Julian's name. I let it ring. He called 5 times in a row, the urgency escalating with every missed connection. After the 7th missed call, the approach shifted. A flurry of text messages began to populate my lock screen. The digital progression of his panic was a fascinating psychological study. The first few messages attempted to maintain a thin veneer of corporate authority. "Emery, we need to have a quick sync to finalize your transition paperwork. Call me back immediately." 30 minutes and 8 more missed calls later, the authoritative tone completely evaporated, replaced by poorly concealed anxiety. "Look, maybe I acted a bit hastily yesterday. The board is putting a lot of pressure on this transition. Pick up the phone so we can figure this out." When noon approached and the deadline from the investment fund loomed closer, the texts devolved into outright bribery. The man who had publicly humiliated me less than 24 hours ago was now digitally begging for his professional life. "Emery, please, I can authorize a massive cash settlement. 6 months of severance, fully paid out today. Maybe we even talk about bringing you back as an external consultant at double your previous rate. Just answer the phone and sign the separation document. Please." By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the missed call counter on my screen had surpassed 20. The silence I was weaponizing was driving him insane. But it was time to end the silence. It was time to speak the only language Julian and the board truly understood. I opened my laptop, the screen shielding my face from the afternoon sun. I did not type a reply to his pathetic messages. Instead, I accessed the central administrative console using my private, legally registered credentials. Julian had assumed that by cutting off my corporate email and company Slack channel, he had locked me out of the castle. He failed to comprehend that I did not just work in the castle, I owned the foundation it was built upon. During the initial development phase 2 years ago, I had legally registered all the server master tokens, the cryptographic keys required to operate the most advanced, high-frequency trading algorithms on the platform, under my own personal corporate entity for liability protection. It was a standard, documented procedure that the board had enthusiastically approved and then promptly forgotten. With a few precise, measured keystrokes, I initiated a complete revocation of those master tokens. I pressed the Enter key. The system logs on my screen immediately lit up with a blinding cascade of red error warnings. Deep within the Apex Vanguard servers, 50% of the platform's advanced features, the very features scheduled to go live for international trading partners in exactly 30 minutes, slammed shut like a steel vault door. The algorithmic trading engines stalled. The secure data bridges collapsed. I had just legally repossessed the engine of the car while Julian was driving it down the highway at 100 miles an hour. I closed the laptop, took a deep breath of the fresh park air, and waited for the real explosion. At precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the digital execution chamber was assembled. The calendar invitation had arrived in my inbox marked with extreme urgency, bypassing all standard scheduling protocols. I clicked the secure link to join the emergency video conference, but I manually disabled my camera and muted my microphone before entering the room. On the massive grid of high-definition faces that populated my screen, I was nothing but a silent, solid black square bearing my name in plain white text. I was the void they were all forced to stare into. The visual contrast across the digital grid was striking and immensely satisfying. The board members of Apex Vanguard looked as though they had aged 5 years since yesterday morning. They sat in their respective high-end home offices, their ties loosened, their faces tight with exhaustion and mounting anxiety. Marcus Sterling, the lead representative and senior partner from Beacon Hill Capital, sat perfectly still in a glass-walled conference room. He radiated the cold, unforgiving energy of institutional wealth. He was not a man who tolerated losing money. And then there was Julian Vance. He looked absolutely wretched. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, a thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead, and his eyes darted frantically across the screen, lingering terrified on my black square. My legal counsel, Vivian Vance, occupied a square in the bottom left corner. She looked effortlessly sharp in a tailored charcoal blazer, calmly sipping sparkling water from a glass, waiting for the bloodletting to begin. Julian attempted to seize control of the narrative immediately. His voice, usually smooth and heavily coded in marketing terminology, was now painfully tight, high-pitched, and incredibly defensive. Listen, everyone. We need to remain objective and look at the bigger picture here, Julian began, gesturing wildly with his hands toward his webcam. What we are experiencing today is a temporary, isolated technical holdup. Emery Cook is engaging in blatant technical hoarding. She is acting out of pure spite. She has always been overly conservative, constantly resisting the rapid growth trajectory of this company. What she is doing right now is nothing short of corporate sabotage, simply because she refuses to accept our new strategic direction. He paused, breathing heavily, clearly expecting the board of directors to nod in agreement, to rally behind his crumbling authority. Nobody moved. The silence on the call was deafening. "Are you quite finished talking?" Marcus Sterling interrupted. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a heavy, crushing density that instantly silenced the digital room. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Marcus, I am just trying to explain the behavioral context behind her actions today." "I do not care about your context, Julian," Marcus stated, leaning closer to his camera until his face filled his frame. "I care about my firm's capital investment. You assured this board, and my managing partners, that you had full operational and legal control of this asset. You lied to us." With a rapid click of his mouse, Marcus seized the screen-sharing privileges of the conference call. A scanned legal document immediately replaced the grid of faces. It was heavily redacted in several places, but the core text was highlighted in glaring bright yellow. This is the intellectual property addendum you personally reviewed and signed in October of last year, Marcus said, his tone entirely devoid of any professional empathy. Read the third paragraph out loud to yourself. It explicitly acknowledges Emery Cook's exclusive personal legal ownership over the cryptographic security architecture of the primary servers. She is not hoarding company property. She is legally packing up her own registered assets because you illegally evicted her. You fired the landlord and somehow expected to keep the keys to the building. Julian opened his mouth, stammering, desperately trying to string together a coherent sentence. We were all advised, that those specific clauses were purely a formality, standard boilerplate protection for founders. Nobody thought she would actually weaponize them. It was at this exact moment that Vivian Vance decided to unmute her microphone. Her voice cut through the thick tension like a surgical scalpel. Mr. Sterling is entirely correct regarding the intellectual property boundaries, Vivian said, smiling politely at the camera. However, the server access dispute is actually the least of Mr. Vance's current legal problems. Julian's face went completely rigid. His eyes widened in sheer panic. As we all know, Clause 8.4c of the founding corporate bylaws requires the unanimous written consent of the board to terminate a founding executive, Vivian continued smoothly. She initiated her own screen share, overriding Marcus Sterling's document. A new highly sensitive file appeared on the screen. It was the official termination authorization form. Julian submitted this exact document to the Human Resources Department yesterday afternoon in a desperate attempt to rush the termination process and cover his tracks, Vivian explained, her cursor circling the bottom of the page. As you can all clearly see, it bears the signatures of all 7 board members. It presents a seemingly perfect execution of corporate protocol. The screen zoomed in heavily on the bottom right corner of the page, focusing intensely on the 7th signature line. However, Vivian said, her voice dropping a full octave, taking on a lethal edge, board member Richard Hayes was on a transatlantic flight to London yesterday morning, a commercial flight with 0 wireless communication access. According to the digital timestamp embedded in the metadata of this document, Mr. Hayes supposedly signed this authorization electronically at 10:30 in the morning, New York time, while he was physically 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. Silence slammed into the virtual room. It was not the stunned, confused silence of yesterday's termination. It was the horrifying, suffocating silence of an impending criminal indictment. On the second row of the video grid, Richard Hayes, looking heavily jet-lagged and sitting in a dimly lit London hotel room, leaned so close to his laptop camera that his face severely distorted. His eyes were wide with absolute, unadulterated fury. "I did not sign that paper," Richard practically growled, his voice trembling with violent rage. "I have not seen that document until this exact second." Julian shrank back into his expensive leather chair, raising his hands defensively as if trying to physically block the words through the screen. "Richard, please listen to me. We needed to move fast to satisfy the restructuring timeline. I just authorized an administrative proxy to expedite the paperwork." "You forged my signature!" Richard roared, slamming his fist violently onto his hotel desk. The sharp crack echoed harshly through his microphone, making several board members flinch. "You forged a federal corporate legal document to push out our chief architect so you could steal the sole credit for the funding round. I will not let you drag my reputation into your disgusting mess. I am calling my private litigation attorneys the second we disconnect from this call. I am going to drag you into federal court for commercial fraud, Julian. You are not just going to lose your job. You are going to a prison cell." Julian Vance collapsed inward. The arrogant, slick executive who had humiliated me in front of the entire financial world 24 hours ago was completely gone. In his place sat a broken, utterly terrified man. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. He stared blankly at his monitor, his mouth opening and closing rapidly without producing a single sound. He finally understood the devastating magnitude of his error. He had not just stepped on a legal landmine, he had swallowed it whole. From the absolute safety of my black square, completely invisible to the carnage unfolding on the screen, I leaned back in my diner booth and took a sip of cold coffee. I allowed myself to smile. The digital execution chamber dissolved into a flurry of panicked disconnections. I simply closed my laptop and waited in the quiet corner of the booth. I knew exactly who would be coming, and I knew exactly how long it would take him to cross the bridge from Manhattan. 2 hours later, a pristine black luxury sedan pulled up to the curb outside the diner. The heavy glass door chimed, and Garrison stepped inside. The chairman of the board of Apex Vanguard looked violently out of place. He wore a bespoke Italian wool overcoat and a silk tie, his expensive leather shoes squeaking awkwardly against the cheap linoleum floor. Yesterday, Garrison had sat in his plush ergonomic chair in the boardroom, his hands steepled perfectly beneath his chin, watching Julian publicly slaughter my career, without offering a single word of intervention. He had been perfectly content to let the engineer take the fall, so the executive team could take the glory. Now he was standing in a greasy spoon in Brooklyn, scanning the faded vinyl booths with thinly veiled disgust. He spotted me, took a deep breath to compose his features, and walked over. He slid into the booth across from me, clutching his coat tightly. "Emery," Garrison began. He attempted a warm, paternal smile, but it failed entirely to reach his exhausted eyes. "Let us put the theatrics aside. We both know Julian overstepped his bounds drastically. The man is an arrogant fool, and the board recognizes that error now. I drove all the way out here through heavy traffic to personally make things right. I did not offer him a coffee. I did not offer him a greeting. I merely watched him, letting the silence stretch out and wrap tightly around his throat." Garrison cleared his throat nervously, pulling a sleek, embossed leather folder from his coat. "We want you back in the building by Monday morning. I am prepared to offer you the Chief Technology Officer position back, fully reinstated with all previous benefits. Furthermore, to compensate for the emotional distress of yesterday's unfortunate misunderstanding, we are doubling your base salary, effective immediately, and issuing a massive grant of bonus equity. It is a highly unprecedented and very generous apology, Emery." No. The single word left my lips flat, entirely devoid of negotiation or emotion. Garrison blinked, his fake smile faltering. "Emery, please be reasonable. You have made your point brilliantly. You scared the living daylights out of Julian. But we are offering you everything you had, plus a massive financial incentive. Take the win." "You are offering me a bandage for a severed limb," I replied smoothly, my voice barely above a whisper. I reached into my leather tote bag and retrieved a thick, cream-colored legal envelope. I placed it squarely on the sticky table and pushed it across the faded formica until it touched his expensive folder. "Vivian drafted this restructuring agreement late last night. I suggest you read it very carefully." Garrison frowned. He picked up the envelope, pulled out the crisp pages, and began to read. As his eyes scanned the densely packed legal text, the paternal warmth completely vanished from his face, replaced by a deep, terrifying pallor. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly under the flickering fluorescent lights. "This," Garrison stammered, his voice dropping to a harsh, reedy whisper, "this is an absolute joke." "I assure you, Garrison, I completely lack the capacity for humor today," I said, leaning forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table. "You are demanding the immediate termination of the entire Executive Operating Committee," he read aloud, his hands trembling slightly, rustling the thick paper, "including Julian, with 0 severance packages. You are demanding the complete and permanent revocation of my personal voting rights on the board. And you are demanding to be appointed as the Supreme Chief Executive Officer of Apex Vanguard, with independent, unilateral control over 75% of the seats on a newly formed board of directors." He dropped the document onto the table and looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of raw horror and utter disbelief. This is absolute madness. It is completely unprecedented in the history of corporate finance. You are demanding a total corporate coup. Emery, you are under 40 years old. You are a brilliant engineer, yes, but you are not a corporate warlord. No institutional investor in their right mind is going to hand supreme executive control to someone your age with these dictatorial terms. Beacon Hill Capital will, I countered, my voice as cold and hard as the ice melting in my water glass. Because Beacon Hill Capital cares about one thing only: their $120 million investment, which is currently tethered exclusively to my proprietary architecture. They do not care about your bruised ego, Garrison, and they certainly do not care about Julian's ruined career or his impending criminal fraud trial. They want the financial system back online, and they want the only person who actually knows how to build it running the entire company. Garrison closed his eyes, his jaw set stubbornly. The existing board will never ratify this agreement. We will tie you up in federal litigation for years. We will find a legal workaround. I let out a soft, slow breath. The negotiation phase was officially over. There was nothing left to discuss. I stood up from the vinyl booth. I smoothly slung my leather tote bag over my shoulder. I looked down at Garrison, who was now staring up at me, suddenly forced to realize the sheer gravity of his physical and strategic disadvantage. He was a man who had lost his kingdom, and he was currently sitting across from the architect who had just bought the land out from under him. You have 30 minutes before Beacon Hill officially withdraws their capital and declares Apex Vanguard bankrupt in the Wall Street Journal, I said. My tone carried the absolute, unyielding finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. I turned and walked toward the diner exit. I pushed open the heavy glass door, stepping out into the cool evening air, and I did not look back. I walked down the quiet Brooklyn street, the cold evening air sharp against my face, my phone resting silently in my coat pocket. I did not have to wait long. Exactly 29 minutes later, the device vibrated violently against my hip. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a secure, encrypted notification from Vivian. The electronic signatures from every single major shareholder, along with the terrified, forced endorsements of the remaining board members, had been officially logged into the corporate registry. The restructuring agreement was now legally binding. The old regime was dead. The following Monday morning, the atmosphere inside the Manhattan Tower was completely unrecognizable. I did not wait in the crowded lobby for the standard staff elevator. Instead, I bypassed the security desk, swiped my newly minted, heavily encrypted access card, and stepped into the private executive lift. I pressed the button for the penthouse level. The ascent was smooth and silent. I was no longer the chief technology officer fighting for scraps of respect. I was the newly appointed chief executive officer of Apex Vanguard. The heavy oak double doors to my new corner office stood wide open. As I crossed the threshold, the morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a pathetic scene. Standing awkwardly in the absolute center of the expansive room was Julian Vance. He was flanked by two towering, broad-shouldered corporate security guards. In his trembling hands, he clutched a cheap brown cardboard box containing a framed photograph, a silver designer pen set, and a branded stress ball. He looked utterly broken, stripped of his expensive cologne and his hollow confidence. "Emery, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of its usual arrogant boom. "You got exactly what you wanted. You own the company now. Just let me walk away quietly. Do not file a public civil lawsuit against me. If you drag my name through the courts, you will destroy my reputation in the technology industry forever. I will never be able to work again. Please, just have some mercy." I did not offer him a single glance. I walked smoothly past his trembling form, the rhythmic click of my heels echoing off the hardwood floor. I approached the massive, polished desk. I sat down in the heavy executive leather chair, the expensive material creaking softly beneath my weight. I opened my personal laptop and connected it to the secure dock. With a few precise, deliberate keystrokes, I executed the master command sequence. Deep within the fortified server room several floors below, the dormant architecture roared back to life. The complex algorithms reconnected seamlessly. The trading system was fully activated. Only then did I raise my eyes and lock my gaze directly onto my former boss. "I am not suing you, Julian," I stated, my voice perfectly level, completely drained of any anger or sympathy. A civil lawsuit takes entirely too much time and energy. I simply sent the entire system log history and the irrefutable digital evidence of your forged board signature directly to the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission exactly 10 minutes ago. The last remaining traces of color completely vanished from Julian's face as the terrifying reality of federal prison finally crushed him. His hands went slack. He dropped his cardboard box. The silver pens scattered wildly across the plush carpet, clattering against the floor. The two security guards immediately grabbed him by his arms, turning him around roughly. They marched him out of my office and pushed him down the main corridor. Through the glass walls of the executive suite, I watched the procession. Dozens of brilliant engineers, developers, and administrative staff members, the very people Julian had spent the last several months bullying and maliciously manipulating, stood completely silent at their workstations. They watched with immense satisfaction as the man who had terrorized them was frog-marched toward the freight elevator like a common trespasser. The floor was finally quiet. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the massive glass window. I looked out over the sprawling, chaotic, beautiful skyline of Manhattan. I picked up my ceramic mug, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip of freshly brewed, perfectly hot coffee. Tomorrow morning, I had a brand new funding pitch scheduled with Beacon Hill Capital. But this time, I was the one holding the microphone, the master code, and the entire board. I was finally the master of the game. Thank you so much for listening to today's story with us. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? Please let us know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this incredible journey of corporate revenge, we kindly ask that you help us keep this channel alive. As we mentioned earlier, YouTube has disabled our monetization, so we rely entirely on our amazing listeners. By joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon, you will gain immediate access to the absolute best, most exclusive true stories that are far too intense to publish on YouTube, fully produced with multiple talented voice actors. You can easily join by scanning the QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by simply clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you again from the bottom of our hearts, and we will see you in the next episode.